Hi everyone, happy Monday. I hope you all had a good weekend. I got in a long run and did some yoga with some colleagues here. Um, I watched all your videos and read all of your comments on the voice thread yesterday and a little bit this morning for some of those late posters. So far, I'm really enjoying using VoiceThread. It's great to actually see your faces and hear your voices and get to actually see some of those wheels turning. That is the one thing that I miss most about teaching little kids is seeing that light bulb pop up. So it was really nice to kind of see you guys thinking. So I hope you're enjoying it as well. It's kind of an experiment for us here this semester. And if it seems worthwhile, then we can keep kind of plugging away at it despite the learning curve for everyone. There were a lot of good comments to respond to. I like how Jono and Adam brought up the need to match our research tools to our questions. That is really essential for any research we're going to be doing, qualitative or quantitative. In qualitative research, we tend to think about how or why questions. Sometimes we ask what. So, for example, how do football players engage with racial bias, right? That's a how question. For quantitative, we tend to think more about how much or how many, to what extent or what degree. Those things are much more numeric than they are descriptive. As Casey mentioned, a lot of the Merriam markers also work for qualitative and quantitative research, right? We need to be making sure that we've adequately described our problem in both types of research. If it's an issue, if there's a problem, we sort of want to know where it is in the greater landscape of education. We want to know how many people it affects, what type of people it affects, to what extent does it affect those people. Doing this really kind of is how we get people to pay attention to our work, right? We want policymakers to read our research. We want practitioners to read our research. And so helping them understand the problem is going to help them understand what it is that we're trying to solve or describe in our research. Several of you also mentioned conceptual frameworks, important for both kinds of research, absolutely. This is also a way in which we help our readers understand where we're coming from and make sense of our point of view. It's not often framed that way explicitly as like, this is my point of view, but our theoretical framework is helping people understand the way in which we are seeing this problem. So I have an example. I was working on a quantitative project with a colleague, and we're looking at these many variables. Most of them don't necessarily measure exactly what we want them to measure because somebody else designed the survey. So we kind of have to use things as a bit of a proxy. Well, how you interpret those variables depends on your theoretical framework. I come from a very sort of instructional leadership kind of background. That's a lot of things that I've been working on recently. His theoretical framework is very much more about power dynamics in school. And so we were looking at this variable, and I'm seeing it as a proxy for instructional leadership. And he's seeing it as a proxy for a power dynamic in school that didn't even cross my mind. So we then went back to the theoretical framework that we had already developed from our literature and said, okay, it's kind of both of those, but for the sake of this paper, we're going to interpret it as instructional leadership because that's the framework we've already established in this paper. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. It could go either way, but we're saying for the sake of our paper, this is how we're going to be interpreting that variable. And we do that with our theoretical framework. So a lot of you talked about the audit trail. It's really important in qualitative research. It's also important in quantitative research, right? We want to know how the data was collected, from whom it was collected, under what circumstances it was collected, right? If we are being if we're putting pressure on people to provide us data, they may not be giving us accurate data, right? So making sure that quantitative data is being collected ethically is also really important. So just, those things may look different, The audit trail may look different in both types of research, but it's important. So a lot of you also talked about reflexivity. You're less likely to see it in quantitative research because many people take the stance of being objective. However, most of us are not objective in the types of problems that we study and the types of questions that we ask. And so qualitative researchers tend to be a little bit more introspective and bring that bias out because they aren't trying to say that they're objective when they're not being objective. They don't have that pressure to do that. But again, it helps readers understand your point of view, where you're coming from, how you see the world, how you interpret your data. That sort of thinking was a little bit new to me because I think I came out of a bit of a more positivist training in my program. And in a recent article, we got a lot of criticism about sort of why we were doing this study and what did it really mean. It was a study about rural schools. And so I felt like in our revision, it was really important for me to call out that several of us have either lived or currently live in rural communities in the state in question or in neighboring states, because I think that really helped the editors see that we knew what we were talking about, that this wasn't sort of some sort of outside thing, or we just, I think it really made it more personal to say, look, we've lived this. Some of us are currently still living this, right? So again, just helps people connect with who you are, how you see the world. I think Kaylin mentioned implications and findings, that they need to match for both types of studies. Absolutely. It's often really easy just to give a generic implication or repeat what somebody else said. But if our work is really to inform policy and practice, our implications really need to be based on evidence and really grounded on what it is that we're seeing. Sarah and Garrett talked about context. I think it's important for both kinds of research as well. And as on the practitioner side, whether or not we choose to use a study as evidence for our own evidence-based practice may depend on the context in which it's collected. A lot of education research comes out of big cities. Some of those findings may or may not be applicable to smaller cities like Lincoln or rural places, such as where I taught in Vermont. Just organizational structures are different, amount of funding is different, the kids are different, and so you kind of have to decide what if that is generalizable, even if it's statistical, because you can look at that and say, well, that's not really the way it is here, so I don't really know if that'll work here. I also really find context important, which is why I do case studies. It really brings together the phenomenon and the setting. And one thing that I also really like is multiple case studies, where you go and you look at the same thing in multiple settings. And I think that if you find the same thing in different settings, that you have a much stronger case of saying, well, this is a really important factor. It doesn't necessarily look the same in every setting, but we can say communication is really important for this, regardless of whether you're in an urban school or a rural school or suburban school. This is important. Let's see, Ben commented about highlighting areas for future research. Research is like a conversation, that we are engaging in, because most of our studies are not going to answer the whole question. And so we have to put together our work with other people's work to kind of build knowledge in areas. And when we identify in our own studies what are areas for future research, not only are we engaging in that conversation, but we're helping to shape that conversation by giving us sort of new questions, new methods, pointing us in a particular direction to fill a gap. So when you do your dissertation, that's a really important area that you would want to consider, because not only are you setting up possibly yourself for future research, but helping others see where fruitful research might go. And as Adam said, we don't necessarily want to jump to quantitative research is the next step. Qualitative research is often framed as either a precursor to quantitative, especially when it results in new theory that can be used in quantitative research, and it's sometimes the case in mixed methods. Sometimes other people will use quantitative first and then just use qualitative to find the answer sort of underneath the numbers. But qualitative can also stand on its own, and it doesn't necessarily have to lead into quantitative research. My current research is using similar methods and questions, but in different contexts. And so what I'm sort of hoping is to find what are those similarities and differences across contexts. Somebody told me recently, well, you could just turn it into a survey. But that doesn't really get at like the things that I study, although there is someone on campus working on a survey of similar things. And we're meeting soon to talk about that, which is great. You know, you can look at the same problem from multiple sides, and that's okay. Let's see. Last but not least, Tanya noted, Miriam's chapter is a good guide for thinking about both types of studies. Again, I agree. Your questions and your methods need to match. Your data and analysis need to allow you to answer the questions that you've asked. That is really hard and really important. And you need a clear logical design. So you might want to tack Miriam's checklist up as you're writing your proposal, as well as when you go to write your dissertation, because it's a really good guide for everything that needs to go into your study design and everything that needs to go into the final report. So keep that handy. Adam is going to be this week's facilitator. I believe he already has a video up in VoiceThread, and I will make sure that that's linked in the modules. If you haven't gotten your CITI training up, you really need to do that, because you will actually be doing data collection, and I need to know that you've had the training that is required for human subjects research, which we do. Let's see. Due date reminders, I have those pulled up. Facilitating discussion boards by Sunday. The article critique worksheet is also due Sunday. And I am going to be checking in with the Writing Center this morning. Last year they had some sort of pilot to do online appointments, and I'm not sure they're still doing that, so I'm going to go take a look at that. But your abstracts will still be due, and if we don't do Writing Center, I'm going to ask you guys to use one another to look at your abstracts. It's always really helpful to have another set of eyes. And if you have someone that's not as familiar with your topic, they can make sure that you're explaining yourself clearly. Because, you know, when we're an expert, we don't always think to explain things as clearly as we should. So it really helps to have somebody else look at our work. All right, so that's it. I look forward to this week's discussion facilitation. Talk to you guys soon.